Right now, as you're listening to this, there is a gene sitting inside your DNA that a court of law could use to argue you were born dangerous. It's called MAOA, the so-called warrior gene. And roughly 1 in 3 of you watching this carries the low-activity variant, the one linked to aggression, the one linked to violence, the one that has already been used in murder trials, not to prove someone guilty, but to argue they couldn't help it, that their biology made them kill. In 2009, an Italian judge looked at a convicted murderer's DNA results, saw that gene, and cut his sentence. It was the first time in European legal history that your genetic code was accepted as a reason you might be less responsible for taking a human life. And since then, the floodgates have opened. Courtrooms across the world are now wrestling with a question that should terrify every single one of us. If your genes made you violent, are you less guilty? Or are you something worse, a permanent threat that society can never fix? To understand how a strand of DNA ended up in a murder trial, you need to go back to 1993. A Dutch geneticist named Han Brunner was studying a large family in the Netherlands. An extraordinary family, and not in a good way. Across multiple generations, the men in this family had a pattern of impulsive aggression, arson, attempted rape, violent outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere. Brunner mapped their DNA and found something remarkable. Every single aggressive male in the family had the same mutation, a defect in the gene that produces an enzyme called monoamine oxidase A, MAOA. This enzyme is a housekeeper for your brain. It cleans up neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine after they've done their job. Without enough MAOA, those chemicals pool in your synapses. Your emotional thermostat breaks, and your brain sits in a state of constant chemical agitation. Brunner published his findings, and the scientific world took notice. But here's where it gets complicated, because Brunner hadn't found a murder gene. He'd found a volume knob. Most people with low MAOA function live perfectly normal lives. They never hurt anyone. The gene doesn't make you violent, but it changes the odds. It shifts the threshold. And 9 years later, a massive study would prove exactly how. In 2002, psychologist Avshalom Caspi and his team published a study that would reshape criminal law. They just didn't know it yet. Caspi followed over 1,000 children in New Zealand from birth into adulthood. He tracked 2 things: whether they carried the low-activity variant of MAOA and whether they'd been abused or neglected as children. The results were stunning. Children who carried the low-activity gene and experienced severe maltreatment were dramatically more likely to develop antisocial behavior, to commit violent crimes, to end up in the system. But here's the critical part. Children with the same gene who grew up in stable, loving homes, they were fine, statistically indistinguishable from everyone else. And children who were abused but carried the high-activity variant, they were more resilient. They bounced back. What Caspi had discovered was a gene-environment interaction. MAOA wasn't a destiny. It was a loaded gun, and childhood trauma was the trigger. This study has been replicated dozens of times across different countries, different populations, different methodologies. The science is about as solid as behavioral genetics gets. And defense attorneys around the world read that paper and saw something very specific: an opportunity. Trieste, Italy, 2007. Abdelmalek Bayout, an Algerian immigrant, got into a confrontation that ended with him stabbing a man named Walter Felipe Novoa Perez to death. The facts weren't in dispute. Bayout killed him. He admitted it. He was convicted. But the sentencing, that's where history was made. Bayout's defense team brought in a forensic geneticist who tested his DNA and found the low-activity MAOA variant. They argued to the judge that Bayout's genetic makeup made him inherently more prone to impulsive aggression, that his biology was a mitigating factor, and Judge Pier Valerio Rianati agreed. He reduced Bayout's sentence by 1 full year, writing in his ruling that the genetic evidence suggested the defendant had a diminished capacity for self-control. Let that sink in. A European court of law looked at a killer's DNA and said, "You're slightly less responsible for this murder because of your genes." Legal scholars across the continent erupted. Some called it a landmark in personalized justice. Others called it the most dangerous legal precedent of the 21st century. Because if your genes can reduce your punishment, what else can they do? The Bayout ruling sent shockwaves through legal circles, but it was a case in rural Tennessee that showed just how far genetic evidence could tip the scales between life and death. In 2006, Bradley Waldroup's wife came to pick up their 4 children from his trailer. She brought a friend, Leslie Bradshaw. What happened next was a nightmare. Waldroup shot Bradshaw 8 times with a rifle, killing her. Then he turned on his wife, attacking her with a machete, nearly severing her finger and chasing her through the woods. She survived. Waldroup was charged with first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. The prosecution wanted the death penalty. His defense team had one card left to play. They brought in a forensic psychiatrist named William Burnett, who tested Waldroup's DNA. Low-activity MAOA. Combined with documented severe childhood abuse, a childhood so brutal that multiple witnesses testified to it. Burnett told the jury that Waldroup's combination of genetic vulnerability and traumatic upbringing created a brain that was, essentially, wired for explosive violence. The jury deliberated. They rejected first-degree murder. They convicted Waldroup of voluntary manslaughter for the killing and attempted second-degree murder for the attack on his wife. He got 32 years instead of a death sentence. The warrior gene had just saved a man's life. While defense attorneys were bringing DNA into courtrooms, neuroscientists were looking at something even more unsettling: the actual brains of violent offenders. Adrian Raine, a criminologist at the University of Pennsylvania, has spent decades scanning the brains of murderers, psychopaths, and people with antisocial personality disorder. And what he found changes the way you think about violence. Using PET scans and fMRI imaging, Raine showed that many violent offenders have reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences. In some killers, this area was practically dark. But Raine found something else too: elevated activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear and aggression center. So you've got a brain that runs hot on rage and cold on the brakes. It's like driving a car with a stuck accelerator and no brake pedal. And here's the uncomfortable part: these aren't choices. Nobody chooses their prefrontal cortex thickness. Nobody decides how reactive their amygdala is. These are structural, measurable, biological differences, and they overlap significantly with carriers of the low-activity MAOA variant. The genetics and the neuroscience are pointing at the same thing. The question isn't whether biology influences violence. That debate is over. The question is what we do about it. Here's where this story splits into two terrifying directions. Because that same genetic evidence that saves a killer from the death penalty, it could also be used to lock someone up forever. Think about it. If a court accepts that your genes make you prone to violence, that's an argument for leniency today. You couldn't help it. Your biology was working against you. Reduced sentence. But flip that logic. If your genes make you inherently dangerous, if your brain is structurally wired for aggression, then you're not just less guilty. You're more of a risk. You're someone who might never be safe to release, and courts have noticed. In some U.S. jurisdictions, prosecutors have started using the exact same genetic evidence, not to excuse violence, but to argue for harsher sentences, for indefinite commitment, for the idea that this person is a permanent threat to society. The warrior gene defense has become a warrior gene prosecution. Legal scholars call this the double-edged sword problem, and nobody has solved it. The same data point, low-activity MAOA, can be read two completely opposite ways depending on who's presenting it and what they want the jury to feel. Your DNA doesn't just tell a story. It tells whatever story the lawyer holding it needs it to tell. And then there's the part of this story that nobody in the courtroom wants to talk about. The frequency of the low-activity MAOA variant isn't evenly distributed across populations. Studies have found that certain ethnic groups carry the variant at higher rates than others. And the moment you combine genetic predisposition to violence with racial demographics, you are standing on the most dangerous intersection in all of science. We have been here before. The history of using biology to brand entire groups of people as inherently criminal is one of the darkest chapters in human history. Eugenics, forced sterilizations, phrenology, pseudoscientific racism that justified slavery, colonialism, and genocide. Researchers studying MAOA are acutely aware of this. Many have published explicit warnings alongside their data, begging the public and the courts not to misinterpret population-level statistics as individual predictions. Because here's the science that gets lost in the headlines: even in populations with higher rates of the low-activity variant, the vast majority of carriers never commit a violent act. Ever. The gene raises a statistical probability across millions of people. It tells you absolutely nothing about the person sitting next to you, but nuance doesn't trend. And when a defense attorney stands up in court and says, "My client's genes made him do it," the simplified version is all the jury hears. If you think the Bayout and Waldroup cases were isolated experiments, think again. Since those rulings, genetic behavioral evidence has appeared in courtrooms across at least 20 countries. In the United States alone, MAOA evidence has been introduced in dozens of criminal cases, murder, assault, sexual violence. A 2012 analysis found that defendants who presented neurobiological evidence, including genetic testing, received significantly shorter sentences on average. In Italy, after Bayout, another case followed almost immediately. A woman named Stefania Albertani, convicted of murdering her sister and attempting to kill her parents, had her sentence reduced after genetic testing revealed both the low-activity MAOA variant and additional genes associated with impulsive behavior. The judge cited the genetic evidence directly in the sentencing reduction. In the Netherlands, in Australia, in Brazil, defense teams are commissioning genetic tests and bringing them to trial. It's no longer a novelty. It's becoming a strategy. And the legal system is scrambling to keep up because there are no standardized rules for how this evidence should be admitted, weighted, or challenged. Every judge is essentially making it up as they go. Strip away the courtrooms, strip away the politics, and you hit the bedrock question that makes philosophers lose sleep. Do we actually have free will? Because if a gene can make you statistically more likely to commit violence, and a brain scan can show that the part of your brain responsible for stopping you from acting on impulse is physically smaller or less active, then at what point do we stop saying someone chose to be violent? We don't blame someone for having a seizure. We don't punish people for the symptoms of a brain tumor. In fact, there are documented cases of individuals developing violent or criminal behavior after a tumor pressed against their prefrontal cortex, and when the tumor was removed, the behavior stopped completely. If that person isn't morally responsible for their actions, then where exactly is the line? Is it the tumor, the gene, the abusive childhood that shaped the developing brain? Our entire justice system is built on the assumption that humans are rational agents who make free choices. Guilty means you chose to do something wrong. But neuroscience is slowly, methodically, relentlessly dismantling that assumption. Not destroying it, but eroding the edges. And every erosion means the rules we've built our civilization on get a little less certain. Here's what keeps researchers up at night. We're not just talking about using genetics in criminal trials after someone has already committed a crime. We're talking about prediction. In 2014, a team at Duke University published research suggesting that patterns in a child's brain and genetics, measured as early as age 3, could predict with startling accuracy which children would go on to have the highest rates of criminal behavior, substance abuse, and poor health outcomes as adults. Not perfectly, not individually, but at a population level with real statistical power. Now imagine a government, any government, that decides to screen children for the warrior gene, for low prefrontal cortex activity, for the biological risk factors associated with future violence. They wouldn't even need to do anything overtly sinister. Just flag those kids for extra surveillance, extra monitoring, a different track through the education system. A watch list before they've done anything wrong. Sound dystopian? The technology exists today. The genetic tests cost less than $100. The brain imaging technology is getting cheaper every year. The only thing standing between us and genetic pre-crime is policy, and policy, unlike DNA, can change overnight. Let's bring this back to you, because statistically, if there are 1 million people watching this, roughly 300,000 of you carry the low-activity variant of MAOA. 300,000 of you have the so-called warrior gene, and you've lived your entire life without knowing it, without it mattering, without it making you anything other than who you already are. That's the final, crucial point that gets buried under the headlines and the courtroom drama. The warrior gene is spectacularly bad at predicting individual violence. It's a risk factor the same way that owning a car is a risk factor for a car accident. True, technically. Useless for predicting which individual will actually crash. The overwhelming majority of people with low MAOA activity are teachers, engineers, parents, artists. They get frustrated in traffic and let it go. They argue with their partners and cool down. They have the same gene that a defense attorney just used to explain away a murder, and it means nothing about their character, their choices, or their future. But here's what should genuinely concern you. Not your own DNA. The fact that legal systems around the world are making life and death decisions based on a gene that scientists themselves say cannot predict individual behavior. Courts are running ahead of the science, and nobody's pumping the brakes. The warrior gene isn't a verdict. It's a question, one that our courtrooms, our science, and our society are nowhere near finished answering. Right now, in a courtroom you'll never hear about, someone's DNA is being entered into evidence. A jury is being asked to weigh biology against blame, and the answer they reach will set a precedent that ripples outward to every single one of us. If this is the first time you've heard about the MAOA defense, you're not alone, but now you know. And this is a conversation that needs more voices, not fewer. Drop a comment. Do you think your genes should matter in a murder trial? And if you want to go deeper into the cases where science collides with justice, subscribe, because this is only the beginning.